Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Sara Horton, who is a medical oncologist and hematologist, currently on the faculty as an assistant professor in the Division of Hematology and Oncology at Howard University Hospital. She is the director of clinical trials at Howard University Cancer Center. Dr. Horton currently focuses on the treatment of solid tumors, specializing in breast, prostate, and gastrointestinal cancers. She has a special interest in clinical trials, currently as the director of clinical trials at Howard University Cancer Center, focusing on disparities in cancer treatment and outcomes. Dr. Horton. Please welcome Dr. Horton. Thank you, Dr. Horton.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
Let's see, I'll put this up here. This way?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, is that good?
Yes, perfect.
Okay.
All right, good morning. So this is a great program, and I thank you for letting me be here today. So as a medical oncologist, what I do is work with Dr. Agotu. Medical oncologists usually are the people who give chemotherapy for cancer. And so with prostate cancer, our goal is to treat the cancer before it gets to the point where you need chemotherapy. So for a lot of men with prostate cancer, you never see a medical oncologist, thank goodness. But if it gets to the point where a man should need chemotherapy, that's usually when the cancer has spread from the prostate to another part of the body, like the bones or the lungs or the liver, and it's what we call metastasized or stage 4, then that's when the role of the medical oncologist becomes important, and I have discussions with the best treatments. Today I'm not here to talk about the chemotherapies. I'm actually here to talk about clinical trials, which is the other hat I wear at Howard's Cancer Center as the director of clinical studies or clinical trials. So today, I just wanted to give a brief overview of what clinical trials in general are, not even necessarily prostate cancer clinical trials, because across all cancers, clinical trials and research is not necessarily understood, not only by lay people, but by doctors. And even oncologists who see patients and urologists may not participate in clinical trials, and sometimes it's because they don't quite understand what we're doing and why it's important. So this is a slide presentation. The slides actually come from NCI that's put together kind of a basics, they call it, for clinical trials. And I like this. I go around to different places as much as I can to talk about the studies. And so it's about 30 slides. I'm going to rush through some of them. If I do rush through a point that you want more clarification on, please stop me and I will get more specific. I've jotted down some notes. So as we know, most of us, if we haven't been either diagnosed with cancer, one of our loved ones has been, or we know someone, and so cancer is something that's around us and we need to be able to talk about it openly and, more importantly, help understand it. So clinical trials in terms of cancer are ways that we can perform studies to try and determine the best, not only treatments for cancers, but ways of preventing cancer. We have prevention trials and screening techniques, looking for cancer in people before they start to cause symptoms, screening. Chemoprevention, taking medicines or fruits or supplements to help prevent cancer, which is important in prostate cancer. Am I able to control the slides?
No, you should say next.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'll look up here. So in terms of what are cancer clinical trials? So in terms of cancer, this is a way for us to research in human beings what happens with some of the treatments. Every treatment that a man receives, be it radiation or pills or injections or chemotherapy, has gone through some type of clinical trial first. And the way that we get as doctors to know that a treatment works and is safe is because people who have the cancer have graciously agreed to participate in a clinical trial that was able to prove that that type of treatment works and is safe. That's the other important part in clinical studies where there's always a question. Is this safe? Is this something that is not going to hurt me? The scientific questions that we answer are across the board, and again, in trying to prevent the cancer, diagnose it, screen for it, and treat. Next, please. So why are clinical trials important? Well, we know that cancer, again, can affect all of us, and that's important in that we should try and do everything that we can to try and prevent it as doctors. That's our goals. I know as people, that's everyone's goal. No one likes to think about developing or being diagnosed with cancer. So in terms of the numbers and the statistics, we all know that there are a lot of people who have been touched by cancer. In America, about 1 million people a year are diagnosed with some type of cancer. About 500,000 people a year die from cancer. So that's about 1,500 people a day diagnosed with some type of cancer. Next, please. So why are they, in terms of clinical trials, why is it important for us? With all these people being diagnosed with cancer, we need to get the best treatment we can to try and prevent it. If we can't prevent it, we need to try and catch it early and try and cure people. If we can't cure someone, we need to give the best treatments we can to have a high quality of life that doesn't cause a lot of side effects. And so those are the goals when we're looking at why we're doing clinical trials. Clinical trials take research that's been done in a laboratory, and it's been tested on cell lines in different test tubes, and it's been found to be effective against those type of cells, say for instance prostate cancer cells. So there's a drug and it's tested in the lab and it's killing the cells, great. So next they move on, they use mice in the lab. The mice usually have some form of prostate cancer which they can produce, and they use the medicine in mice. It's the closest thing we have to a human that is safe, and we can determine if it's safe in the mice and if it causes those cancer cells to die. And if that happens, especially if it looks very, very good, it really takes that cancer away, the next step is to start clinical trials in human beings. Okay, so we've got that it's safe, at least in animals, and that it works, at least in the laboratory. When we talk about the term translational treatment, that means taking this information from the lab, translating it over into our patients that we see in the office. So the next step is going through the different phases of clinical trials that happen in human beings. Next, please. So in terms of enrolling patients on clinical trials, about 3% of all people who are eligible for a clinical trial actually agree to be in those studies. So that's not a lot. You know, if you think about everybody who's been diagnosed with any kind of disease and that there's a study open for, 3%. And because of a lot of things. Doctors aren't referring them. There's a fear of studies. People don't quite understand what it is. There might already be a treatment that they want to take. Next, please. So we kind of went over already the different types of clinical trials. There's treatment trials. We talked about prevention studies. There's a lot in prostate cancer looking at taking different types of selenium or vitamins or supplements to prevent prostate cancer. There's early detection or screening studies. That's what Dr. Gotu was talking about in terms of the PSAs. Is it effective at trying to detect little cancer cells before they actually start causing problems so you can remove them quickly? Won't ever be a problem in the future. Diagnostics trials, meaning looking at technology that we have, MRIs, different type of x-rays to see if we can detect any cancer earlier. And then quality of life or supportive studies. And that's usually when the cancer has gotten to a point where we don't have good treatment. And our goal is to just try and make sure that the symptoms from the cancer don't make life really bad for the patient. Okay, next please. So when we're testing anything through clinical studies, there are 3 phases of clinical trials. The first phase is the earliest phase, and that's when we talked about it's been found to be effective and safe in the lab. Then you go to phase 1. That's the first phase in human beings. And so this is usually a small study, usually 15 to 30 individuals are used, and they've agreed to participate in using the therapy to find out what the best dose is and to make sure that it's safe. Those are the 2 goals of phase 1 studies. Phase 1 studies are usually done in people who have already gone through all the treatments that they have for their cancer, and their doctor has said, look, we're at a point where we don't have any other treatments available. And so they may opt to go to a phase 1 study because there are times when there's something new that is effective in their type of cancer that we just don't know about. And we find that it's effective when they're in that phase 1 study. Okay. Next, please. Then if the drug has been found to be effective and we found the right dose, and usually they have a group of 3 or 5 patients take 1 dose, and if it's safe, they go up to the next dose and they find the best dose that doesn't cause a lot of side effects. They go on to the phase 2 study. Phase 2 studies are when the the treatment is used in all the patients who are in that study, and that's usually about 50 or 60 patients. And the goal of a phase 2 study is to show how well it works against that cancer. Okay, so we've already known that it's safe. We found the dosage that we want to use. Then phase 2, we give everybody that dose and we find out how well it works against the cancer. Okay, we already know that there's usually a standard treatment for a type of cancer. Say you're diagnosed with prostate cancer, your doctor will say, well, based on all the evidence right now, the best treatment and the standard of care treatment is to give you this. So if we're doing a phase 2 study and we're using a treatment and it's working really well and it looks like it's working as well as that standard that your doctor would tell you that you should be using next anyway, that's when we say, let's go to phase 3 and compare this new treatment to our standard of care. Next, please. So the phase 3 study is when we compare our new treatment, and it may be an absolutely new drug that hasn't been approved yet by FDA, experimental. It may be a drug that's been around for a long time that we know is safe in, say, lung cancer, but now we're testing it in prostate cancer. But we take that drug and we compare it to what the standard of care is. There are very few cases, but there are some cases when the standard of care is when you're not getting any treatment. So, for instance, we don't have a lot of good chemotherapies for pancreatic cancer. So after someone has their first round of chemotherapy, if they don't do well, they still may be very healthy, but we don't have any more drugs if their cancer starts to grow, even though they had that chemotherapy. At that point, because we don't have any known drugs that are available, even if that patient is still very healthy, the only thing we have to offer is just making sure that they feel well. We don't have any effective treatments. That's when a phase 3 study may divide the patients when they're comparing to doing no chemotherapy, just what we usually do is support them, versus trying the new chemotherapy. And so that's using a placebo is when the standard of care is no treatment. And I talk about that because I hear that a lot from patients. I don't want a placebo, I don't want a sugar pill, or I don't want to get nothing. And most phase 3 studies do not use placebos unless it's that situation I just talked about, where if you were not in the clinical trial, the next thing your doctor would do anyway is to say, let's not use chemotherapy. Okay, next. So randomization, that's a term that's used a lot when we talk about clinical trials, and it just describes how the participants of the studies are put on the different arms of the study. Okay. And so it's totally random, just like the word randomization. It's computer generated through a central place that we are not part of, because most studies are done at many different places across the country or the world. And so Howard participates in studies that are being performed at hundreds of other places across the world. And so when we enroll a patient, if I have a patient and our study is open at Howard and they say they want to be on that study, if they qualify, I send the information to a centralized place and they randomly determine whether that patient's going to get one arm, either the experimental drug or the new drug versus the standard drug. Okay? And we're blinded most of the time. The doctors don't know, the patients don't know, and we all don't know until the very end of the study, after the information has been gotten, unless someone has a problem on the study. And then at any point, they can disenroll or we can unblind it. Next, please. So again, this is just a pictorial of randomization. So you start off with 10 people who have agreed to be on the study, and then the computer generates which ones go on which arm of the study. Okay, next, please. And why is that important? It's because what we want to do is have the best balance of patients in each arm. So we want to compare apples with apples. So if each person was allowed to choose which arm that they wanted to go on, then you'd have an unbiased population. Some people may want to go for this reason, and some may want to go for the other reason, and it may be because of something about them or their body that may affect the outcome of the studies. So randomization just takes away that bias. Okay, next, please. So again, with cancer treatment trials, we went through originally the different types of trials: treatment, prevention, and screening. So the treatment trials are the actual chemotherapy or pill or radiation treatments to the cancer that we're testing. Okay. Next, please. Thank you. Again, we talked a little bit about placebos, the fact that they're almost never used, but if they are used, it's because they are standard of care at that point. Next, please. Oh, and if placebos are used in a study, that's discussed with the patient. You know that. It's never anything that's hidden or not told to the patient, so you can make that decision if you want this or not. The other type of treatments we have are prevention trials. Again, there are some looking at different foods that are healthy, exercise. It could be also medication, which are called chemoprevention trials. And so the difference in prevention studies from treatment studies are that prevention studies, the patients do not have cancer. Okay? And so we know right now there's nothing really that's been proven in prostate cancer that's standard, that we have shown that prevents cancer, other than healthy lifestyle, looking at some supplements. In breast cancer, there was a chemoprevention study that divided women who are at high risk for breast cancer to take a pill. It's a chemotherapy pill called tamoxifen versus not taking that. And they found that that pill reduced the risk of women at high risk of getting breast cancer by half, by 50%. So that became accepted as a standard for any woman who's at high risk. This pill, which has side effects, so we are always concerned when we're talking about chemoprevention trials, you're talking about healthy people taking a medication that can cause side effects. So it has to be very effective if it's something that we're going to be considering a standard for people. Next, please. All right, so the clinical trials, the actual physical clinical trial protocol. A protocol is just the paperwork that outlines what this study is supposed to be doing. It answers the question of why are we doing this study? The person who heads the study is called the principal investigator. And that's a researcher who had this idea. I want to see, based on what I know about this cancer and this drug, I want to develop this study to look at whether it's going to work in human beings. And so they make this protocol up where it outlines why they want to do this, what kind of patients they're going to need, how it's going to be done, how they're going to test for it, and the type of things that they're going to look for to see if it's effective. And then they submit that to the National Cancer Institute, where it's reviewed by a board of experts and scientists, and if it's felt to make sense and effective, and more importantly, if it's felt to be safe, because there's a huge human protection agency for patients that start at this level in terms of making sure that what's being done is ethical and is not going to be hurting patients. Then if that protocol is accepted, then it can be put out into the offices, into the clinics, and start enrolling patients. Okay, next, please. So benefits of participating in studies. People say, well, why should I enroll in a clinical trial? Why can I just take whatever my doctor says I should take? What's out there now? Number one, at a minimum, with phase 3 studies, you're going to get the best standard of care. Okay, so it's going to be the standard of care, what anybody would get anyway, versus something that looks like, at this point, it could be better. Okay? We won't know until the end of the study if it's better, the same, or worse, which can happen, but usually not, and we always don't want it to be worse, but at least through the phase 1 and 2, it looks like it's going to be better. If the new treatment is proven to work, that patient may have just gotten the newest and the best treatment. And so it's also a rigorous process, meaning that when you're in a clinical trial, you're following up every few months, every few weeks. So you've got a lot of people watching you, watching this cancer, making you sure that you're getting the right drugs at the right time, the right dose, and it's safe. And so there is a lot of comfort in that fact that you're being watched so closely. And the best thing, I think, is that whatever a participant is doing on a clinical trial is going to help people with cancer in the future. And not only cancer, but any clinical trial that's being done. That information is going to be what leads to us saying, this is the next best thing. Next, please. There are risks, of course. So we all know that maybe that new treatment isn't going to work as well. Okay? There might be some side effects that a person gets that we don't anticipate because it's a new treatment, even though we've done our phase 2 studies to try and predict this. And the last is that health insurance may not cover it. The majority of the time, health insurance health insurances do cover clinical trials. But before anyone is put on a study, they have a huge financial kind of overview with one of our people. And if it looks like a study is not going to be covered, then the patient has the option of saying, I don't want to be on this. Next, please. Patient protection, which is the most important part, is that there are regulations that have been put in place to protect patients from unethical and inappropriate research. And so that came from several things that we probably all have heard about. Number one is from World War II and from the Nazi research on concentration camp victims. The Nuremberg trials developed the Nuremberg Code, which is the first kind of overview of different regulations to help protect human beings. From the United States, we've all probably heard about the Tuskegee syphilis study, which was done from the 1930s to the 1970s. So 40 years of following men, poor African-American men in Tuskegee who had syphilis. And these men were told that if they participated in the study, that they would get free medical care, but they did not get a known treatment for the disease. And so those researchers were basically following these men who had syphilis because they wanted to know what happens in a person if you don't treat syphilis. Okay? When that was identified and eventually the people were persecuted, these type of human protections in the United States came to play. And this starts out in the NCI, and it goes across any study that's performed in the United States. But what it is it's a series of things put in place to protect our patients from any unethical treatment. Next, please. So the four things that are in place for protection is one, informed consent, which I'll talk about very quickly, which is just discussing everything with the patient at a level that they understand and they're given the time to review it, and that they sign to agree, but they also sign to say that if I want to stop at any time, I can stop. Okay. Number two is scientific review. Every study has to be reviewed by an expert scientific body before it started and has predetermined times when it's going to be re-reviewed to make sure that nothing is quite, going wrong that they had not anticipated. There's not a lot of side effects, something that they didn't expect is happening, and if it is happening, to stop the study. There's an institutional review board. So every place that has a study open, that place, Howard, has its own institutional review board, and they call that IRB. And so each institute, even though it's been reviewed by the NCI Scientific Review Board, each institute has to say, yeah, okay, we understand this study and we say it's okay, or okay, maybe NCI said it's okay, but we don't like this part, we're not going to let this open. And that happens. And then the data safety and monitoring boards, and those are a board of experts that come together, and they're not related to any of the institutions that are participating in the study. They're unbiased, and they go around and they, at different times of the study, stop it and check to make sure everything is safe with their patients. Next, please. So the informed consent is, again, it starts out as a paper. And so what it is a written paper that describes everything that's in the protocol, but for the patient to understand. So usually it's 1 or 2 pages. By mandate, it is to be written at the level of a 5th grader to understand, so that anybody who is wanting to understand this should be able to understand it. And this is reviewed with the patient. It talks again about why it's being done, what's expected, and what potential side effects and benefits should happen. And this is discussed with the patient and the doctor and the nurse and the whole team. And then the patient is told to go home and you can show this to your doctor or your family member or your support or whomever and see if they have any questions about it, and take your time, a week, whatever, and tell us if you're interested. And if so, then that consent is signed and dated. So that's informed consent. At any time, though, even though that happens, a patient can say, you know what, I've had second thoughts, I don't want to do this. They don't have to do it. Okay. So next slide, please. The scientific review, we kind of talked about the institutional review boards we talked about. Next one, please. And the data safety monitoring boards are just there to, while the trial is going, to make sure it's safe. Next, please. So why are there so few people on studies? Well, one is that sometimes people are just unaware. They don't know that there's a clinical trial open. way clinical trials are performed, they're open all over the country and all over the world. So you'll go to Howard and we'll have some studies open. You'll go to Georgetown and they'll have some studies open. We may have some that are the same, and then we'll have some are totally different. There are just so many clinical trials being performed that not one place will have them all. And that's important for you to know if you're ever interested in a study, because what you want to do is make sure you look at every place that, if you're interested, that may have it. And there is a site, and at the very end, this last slide has a phone number, but the website is clinicaltrials.gov. It's very easy. It's the National Cancer Institute's online kind of data bank of all clinical trials. And so if you go to clinicaltrials.gov, it doesn't have to be cancer, any type of disease, diabetes, you want to know if there's a study. You just type in the disease process, press enter, and it will show you. You could say, I want to know what's being done in DC, what's being done in the region, that kind of thing. The other reason that we may not have a lot of people on trials is that access to trials. So not every cancer center has clinical trials open. And so that does restrict if a patient couldn't become a participant if they don't have the access to the places. Most universities do have clinical trials. Nowadays, some of the bigger cancer centers have clinical trials as well. So it's always important if you're ever, you know someone, or if you ever, God forbid, have to go to an oncologist. Like I tell people, I never want to see you other than to say hello in the street. But if you have to go to an oncologist, make sure you ask. Do you all participate in clinical trials? Either the first visit before you go, if that's something that's important to you. The other is don't be afraid or suspicious of research. So some people, because of all the things we talked about that's occurred in research in the past, may not trust the research and scientists. And some people think that it costs money to be in a clinical trial. And again, 95% of the time, there's no cost to you other than what you would have if you were not on a clinical trial through your insurance. But that is reviewed before anybody starts a study. And then the umbrella's there, let's see. May not, okay. Some physicians are leery of clinical trials and they don't want their patients on a study. And they'll tell their patients that, and that's their choice, but this is just to inform people of what's out there. So if you are interested in a study, even if your doctor's not, everybody has the independence to go and make sure that they're at a place that participates. Next, please. So why doctors may not want you to be in a study. Again, some doctors feel that they lose their patients when they go on a clinical trial if the clinical trial is not done where they practice. So it's important that, for us, example, at the Cancer Center, I call every doctor who has a patient on one of my studies, keeping them up to date, send them records and notes. I encourage the patients to go back to their primary care doctors, those kind of things, so that you don't lose your patient. And again, sometimes the doctors feel that the treatment that's out there now is the best and they don't want to try anything that's not been proven yet on their patients. Next, please. So this is the last page of my discussion that has the information for clinical trials. So the very last, or www.cancer.gov, that's the National Cancer Institute's website. It's a wonderful source of information for anything cancer. For patients, for doctors, that's where the clinicaltrials.gov site is housed as well. And so you can either get to the clinical trials through clinicaltrials.gov or through the cancer.gov site. And that's the phone number as well, 1-800-4-CANCER. And 1-800-4-CANCER is if you just have a question about cancer. Either you know someone or anything, you have a question about cancer, there's someone during the Monday through Fridays who will pick up and help direct you to someone who can help you with that question. Right, so that's a brief overview. I hope I made it understandable. Please, if there's any questions, feel free to ask.
Okay, anybody have any questions? Let me just make one. We're going to have to put you on speed dial as a contact.
Sure.
We had talked about, Dr. Goethe had talked about the United States Task Force.
Yes.
In regards to the fact that they made a recommendation that asymptomatic men, should not be tested with PSA testing. Unfortunately, it did not include a lot of African Americans that Dr. Goethe mentioned. So therefore, if we're going to be part of any studies, we have to start participate, learning to participate.
Yes.
Otherwise, there's going to be a lot of information that other people are going to benefit from that we're not going to be able to benefit from.
Definitely.
Is that somewhat correct?
Definitely, especially in prostate cancer. For some reason, there has been this just surge of this very exciting to me clinical trials looking at low side effect ways of preventing prostate cancer. And so what we're doing is, because like you said, the U.S. Preventative Task Force has started to state in prostate cancer that PSAs may not be the best way to determine if a man has prostate cancer. You know, Dr. Goto and I tend to disagree with that because there's such a high prevalence of prostate cancer in the African American population. And so most bodies that make these guidelines outside of the U.S. Preventative Task Force also agree in that they say that they don't recommend PSA testing for men, definitely, less than 40 or less than 50, except if they're in a high-risk group. And so most places consider African American men based on the number of prostate cancer cases a year as a high-risk group in and of itself. And so we still recommend starting at 40 PSA testing until something better comes along. So that's what the exciting thing is now, because there's some concern that PSA may not be the best way to detect cancer. They're looking at different molecular, and when you get down to now, they're not just looking at, a blood test that shows a general rise in one of the biological markers. They're looking at really specific things on that PSA test molecules that are more specific. So when you do that test, it's more likely that that person has prostate cancer. And I think that next generation of tests is going to be better than the PSA. And so I think it's not going to be don't do the PSA, which is what people are saying now, but it's going to be let's do this test instead. And so that's what we're, as we're encouraging men to continue to get their PSAs done until we have the next best thing.
Dr. Horton,
Yes.
if I understood that decree from the Preventive Task Force or whatever, is it true that at this stage of what we know now, isn't the PSA the most reliable indicator?
Yeah.
It is.
Yes, it is.
So why discard that if you don't have something better?
So what has changed the view in terms of getting the PSA is looking at this test in terms of when it doesn't predict cancer, and what happens in terms of the number of men who are referred for biopsies and undergo biopsies and have a lot of extra testing done, and a lot of time and anxiety and money is spent on a test that is not necessarily always predictive of cancer. So what they are trying to do is when they looked at, so what they do is they tried to look at all the men who are getting PSAs. And they looked at, out of all the ones that are being done, starting at 40, the percentage that actually turned out to be cancer. And then you followed that out to see people who actually got treatment and had improvement in their survival. Versus the number of men who had those studies is the improvement that you got from the PSA testing in terms of the life that was, the years, they had to predict the years that they benefited, plus the expenses that were incurred. Is that worth, I don't want to use the word worthwhile, but is that the best way for us to try and pick up prostate cancers? Is there a group that it was so low, you do 100,000 tests and you pick up 2 prostate cancers? To do all those tests and maybe you had 200 that were negative and 2 that were positive. Is that test, the type of test that we should be continuing to give to every man in terms of picking up prostate cancer? And so we're trying to get a better test that if you test 200 men, with this test and it's positive, you'd love to get all 200. Well, not you would love, but you would want your test to be that specific that if it's positive, that high likelihood it's cancer. And the same thing is happening with women in mammograms.
Sure is. I heard about that.
Yeah, and so, it's the same type of scenario where, we tend to see breast cancer in younger women. And so when the United States Task Force said not to do mammograms in younger women because it didn't really pick up enough to make it worth, we said, well, that really affects our population more than others. So we really don't want that to happen. Same thing in prostate cancer.
Thank you.
Okay.
I think it's probably very, very important that we keep you in our Rolodex, because if anyone that you know that's thinking about a clinical trial, we have a subject matter expert that's right here that we feel that we can trust and we can talk to, to guide us through clinical trials. And I think it's of the utmost importance that, with a lot of research going on, we'll never be part of the solution, since it impacts us on the most if we do not go ahead and participate in clinical trials. And a lot of times patients ask me, they say, we heard about the syphilis, and the broncho,
Right.
and but you very explicitly explain how all the controls are in place. So we don't really need to be afraid of doing the clinical trials. This is a disease that's impacting on us, and unless we start taking control of our own lives, in research, we're going to have people making recommendations like the task force. That's really what I'm saying is really suicide for us as African American men, by not participating in clinical trials. And so I'm going to put you on my speed dial.
Please do. And what you said is so important. So as researchers, one thing that we look at when the U.S. Task Force makes these announcements and decisions is we look at how many of these patients that they're basing their decision on were necessarily African American. Does this really reflect what's going on in our population? And we as a group of people tend not to want to be in clinical trials historically. I see that changing in our institution because I have my patients asking me about studies these days, which I love, that they're out there, they're listening, they're trying to make the best decisions for themselves. And so, and the more information we get from a diversity of people, the more comfortably we can say, look, based on this study that had 20% African American men in it too, we know that this effect should be the same in our population as it is in any other, because we had our population in that study. And I have one very quick anecdote, and then I'm going, is that when I was in training, I have an aunt who lives in the mountains of North Carolina, because that's where I'm from, and she's 75 years old at the time, and she's not married, no kids, and she called me, she said, you know what, I was diagnosed with breast cancer, and it spread to my lymph nodes, and this doctor is talking about putting me on a clinical trial, and she's like, I don't want chemo, much less go on a clinical trial. She said, will you look at this consent form for me and go over it? So I was, number one, I was excited and happy and surprised that my Aunt Liv was calling me about a clinical trial from the mountains of North Carolina, and I was happy her doctor talked to her about it. But we reviewed it. I knew enough at that point that was an exciting trial to me. It looked like it was going to be very good and helpful. She decided to go ahead, 75 years old, she had diabetes, she had hypertension, but otherwise she's a healthy, strong woman. She went through the study. She just really did not have a lot of problems. Thank goodness, she got through it, and she's telling my family, I'm going through this, and they're looking at me, she looks great, she has cancer. So this was 10 years ago. She is not, she's in her 80s now. She's going to our family reunions. She has not had a recurrence for breast cancer. That study is now the standard of care for breast cancer, giving the chemotherapy the way she had it. And she is African American, and she was older too. That's the other thing, because when I was in my training and I went to a breast cancer conference, I remember saying back then the recommendations were, we can't tell you if it's okay to give chemotherapy to women over 70, just because our clinical trials don't have patients over 70. So we don't know if it's bad, but we can't say it's good. So now we have older patients, if they qualify, and we can say it's okay to put a 75-year-old, because we've done it and we see that they do just as well as the 65-year-olds if all of these things are in place. So please, if there's ever a question or you need any kind of resource of information on clinical trials, feel free.
I have a contact information. Saul, you have one last question. Thank you.
Okay, Saul Graham. I'm a prostate cancer survivor, diagnosed in 2004, had surgery, and again, this past year I went through radiation because the PSA started to back up. One of the things that I learned during that time, and let me, in sake of full disclosure, I am also was trained in my early days as a research technician and worked in cancer research for many years. One of the things that struck me doing my radiation and looking at the diets was the fact that I was told at that particular time that testosterone fed cancer cells, prostate. And one of the things that struck me was, you know, as African American males, we are quick to grab supplements if in fact it seems like our testosterone or our aggressiveness are going away. I mean, I think that that's something that I've not heard discussed in prostate cancer literature, because I read everything when I learned that I had prostate cancer. And I'm just wondering whether or not that's something that we need to be looking at and addressing. And since we have, you know, some of the experts here, I just decided I'd bring that up.
Yes.
Will you address it? Dr. Hussein, is that something you could address when you come up? Or we have Dr. Hussein from Baltimore, so we may be able to address that.
Okay.
Will you join me? I'm sorry.
Can I make one comment to the gentleman? I do know, based on Dr. Agotu is my physician, and I do know that before I received brachytherapy, I'm a 10-year prostate cancer survivor. One of the things he told me, and he just talked to me just like I was a medical student, he said, we're going to starve the prostate cancer. They gave me an injection which was supposed to starve the testosterone. And it took 5 weeks, and then that's when they did it.
Same thing with me. But it's a question that,
Right.
as a research technician,
Right.
I'm saying, why aren't we looking at that? Why aren't we actually
Talking.
trying to, you know, educate folks?
Well, we have Dr. Hussein that will be addressing. Dr. Horton, we can't thank you enough for taking the time of your busy day for joining us and educating us.
Thank
So
you.
thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.